Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, which is the second book in the Barchester series, and the first book was The Warden, which I read out loud with Mark at Book Time with Elvis and with Micah Cummins last year. And that told the story of a charitable hospital in the cathedral town of Barchester that was run by a kindly old warden, Mr. Harding. And another major character in that book was his daughter, Eleanor, who is swept off her feet romantically by a reformer named John Bold, who is dead when Barchester Towers starts and has left her a wealthy widow. And so the object of attention by a couple of predatory beings in Barchester who would like to marry a widow with £1,200 clear a year of her own. But that novel also left the occupancy of the warden of this charitable hospital in doubt until Parliament steps in and decrees there will be a hospital, there will be a full roster of poor old beadsmen who live there, and there will be a warden who will draw an annual salary of £450. Which opens the question of, well, who will go back into the position of being the warden? Most of Barchester and most of the ecclesiastical powers of Barchester Cathedral expect that it will be Mr. Harding. Mr. Harding expects for a long time that it will be himself if that happens, because he was so beloved in that position, because he's synonymous with it. But there's a new power in town. There's a new bishop, Dr. Prouty, and his wife, Mrs. Prouty, and their chaplain, Mr. Slope. And Mr. and Mrs. Prouty would like to be able to have the patronage of the diocese entirely in their own hands. They kind of like the idea of a new broom sweeps clean. They kind of like the idea of whoever goes into that hospital position being a toady of theirs, someone entirely dependent on them and grateful to them to help consolidate their power over this cathedral town. So they propose someone else, a man named Mr. Quiverful, who is a poor curate who has 14 children, the youngest of whom is 2 or 3, the oldest of whom is in her 20s, and almost no money to provide for them. So he's desperate, as he puts it himself, he's desperately, desperately poor. It's assumed on the part of Mrs. Prouty, who very much wants this change to happen, that if we put Mr. Quiverful into that job, he'll be eternally grateful. He will be a lapdog. And she controls her husband completely. The Bishop of Barchester is henpecked. So she controls him and gets him to say, well, this is the way it's going to be. The reason why Mr. Slope doesn't want it to be Mr. Quiverful, the reason why he wants it to be Mr. Harding, has nothing to do with how beloved Mr. Harding is and nothing to do with what's good for Hiram's Hospital, the charitable hospital. It only has to do with him conniving to win the hand of Eleanor Bold, Mr. Harding's daughter, in marriage so that he can have control of her money. But nevertheless, whether that's a sufficient motivation or not, it sets him in opposition to his patroness, Mrs. Prouty. And we see that opposition explicit in our last chapter, where Mr. Slope rides out to Puddingdale, to the church of poor Mr. Quiverful, sits him down in his parlor, and tells him he is not to get the position at the hospital. This is after it has been assured to him, not only by Mr. Slope, but to Mrs. Quiverful by Mrs. Prouty. They've absolutely assured the Quiverfuls that they will get the job, to the extent that the tradesmen in Barchester, who previously knew how poor Mr. Quiverful was and weren't going to extend him any credit, do him any favors, now they are willing to extend him credit, to the extent where the family has bought things on the strength of that credit, having been assured by everyone they thought was involved that it was certain. Mr. Quiverful gets the news that it's not going to happen, and that the bishop has plenty of other good things in his gift. It won't be long before he remembers Mr. Quiverful, but it won't be the hospital. It won't be immediate. Mrs. Quiverful is not in the room when that scene happens, but in this next scene, we get her reaction. We can guess what it will be, but here Trollope does not disappoint. This is chapter 25, 14 arguments in favor of Mr. Quiverful's claims. And I've never seen an edition of Barchester Towers that actually footnotes the title of this chapter. The title of this chapter is an explicit call-out. It's an explicit allusion to something that all of Trollope's readers in the mid-19th century would have known. You don't need to worry about it. Just the only reason that I mention it at all is because it's going to confuse you. The chapter does not include 14 points. It is just a contemporary allusion on Trollope's part, a kind of a slangy chapter title that references something that had taken the position in the public mind of being an exhaustive case. That's all. You don't need to worry about the number 14, and you don't need to worry about the antecedent. It's just that. It's meant to mean an exhaustive case. 14 arguments in favor of Mr. Quiverful's claims. We have most of us heard of the terrible anger of a lioness when, surrounded by her cubs, she guards her prey. Few of us wish to disturb the mother of a litter of puppies when mouthing a bone in the midst of her young family. Medea and her children were familiar to us, and so is the grief of Constance. Mrs. Quiverful, when she first heard from her husband the news which he had to impart, felt within her bosom all the rage of the lioness, the rapacity of the hound, the fury of the tragic queen, and the deep despair of the bereaved mother. Doubting, yet hardly fearing what might have been the tenor of Mr. Slope's discourse, she rushed back to her husband as soon as the front door was closed behind the visitor. It was well for Mr. Slope that he had so escaped. The anger of such a woman at such a moment would have cowed even him. As a general rule, it is highly desirable that ladies should keep their temper. A woman, when she storms, always makes herself ugly, and usually ridiculous also. Really, Tony? Thanks. There is nothing so odious to a man as a virago. Though Theseus loved an Amazon, he showed his love but roughly, and from the time of Theseus downward, no man ever wished to have his wife remarkable, rather for forward prowess than for retiring gentleness. A low voice is an excellent thing in a woman. Such may be laid down as a very general rule, and few women should allow themselves to deviate from it, but then only on rare occasions. But if there be a time when a woman may let her hair to the winds, when she may loose her arms and scream out trumpet-tongue to the ears of men, it is when nature calls out within her not for her own wants, but for the wants of those whom her womb has borne, whom her breasts have suckled, for those who look to her for their daily bread as naturally as man looks to his Creator. I don't think this was on Tony's mind when he wrote this passage, but allow me to put in my 2 cents worth that if you're one half of society, you're being denied the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to walk around unescorted, the right to have a drink or a meal in a bar by yourself, feel free to shout. Okay? It doesn't have to be for your babies. Feel free to shout until you're an equal citizen. Anyway. There was nothing poetic in the nature of Mrs. Quiverful. She was neither a Medea nor a Constance. When angry, she spoke out her anger in plain words, and in a tone which might have been modulated with advantage. But she did so, at any rate, without affectation. Now, without knowing it, she rose to a tragic vein. Well, my dear, we are not to have it. Such were the words with her ears were greeted when she entered the parlor, still hot from the kitchen fire. And the face of her husband spoke even more plainly than his words. What? Said she. What? Not have it? Who says so? And she sat opposite her husband, with her elbows on the table, and her hands clasped together, and her coarse, solid face, but once handsome face, stretched over it towards him. She sat as silent as death while he told his story, and very dreadful to him was her silence. He told it very lamely and very badly, but still in such a manner that she should understand the whole of it. And so you have resigned it? She said. I have had no opportunity of accepting it, he replied. I had no witnesses to Mr. Slope's offer, and even if that offer would bind the bishop, it was better for me on the whole to keep on good terms with such men than to fight for what I should never get. Witnesses? She screamed, rising quickly to her feet and walking up and down the room. Do clergymen require witnesses to their words? He made the promise in the bishop's name, and if it's to be broken, I'll know the reason why. Did he not positively say that the bishop had sent him to offer you the place? He did, my dear, but that is now nothing to the purpose. It is everything to the purpose, Mr. Quiverful. Witnesses, indeed, and then to talk of your honor being questioned because you wish to provide for 14 children. It is everything to the purpose, and so they shall know, if I scream it in their ears from the town cross of Barchester. You forget, Letitia. That's her name, Letitia. You forget, Letitia, that the bishop has so many things in his gift. We must wait a little longer, that is all. Wait? Shall we feed the children by waiting? Will waiting put George and Tom and Sam out in the world? Will it enable poor girls to give up their drudgery? Will waiting make Betsy and Jane fit even to be governesses? Will waiting pay for the things we got in Barchester last week? It is all we can do, my dear. The disappointment is as much to me as it is to you, and yet God knows I feel it more for your own sake than for my own. Mrs. Quiverful was looking full into her husband's face and saw a small, hot tear appear on each of those furrowed cheeks. This was too much for her woman's heart. He also had risen and was standing with his back to the empty grate. She rushed towards him and, seizing him in her arms, sobbed aloud upon his bosom. "You are too good, too soft, too yielding," she said at last. "These men, when they want you, they will use you like a cat's paw, and when they want you no longer, they throw you aside like an old shoe. This is twice they've treated you so." She's right. "In one way this will be all for the better," he argued. "It will make the bishop feel that he's bound to do something for me." "At any rate he shall hear of it," said the lady, again reverting to her more angry mood. "At any rate he shall hear of it, and that loudly. And so shall she. She little knows Letitia Quiverful if she thinks I will sit quietly down with the loss after such passed between us at the palace. If there's any feeling within her, I'll make her ashamed of herself." And she paced the room again, stamping the floor as she went with her heavy foot. Good heavens, what a heart she must have within her to treat in such a way as this the father of 14 unprovided children. Not 100% sure why the two oldest girls can't get a job. Maybe we're being told that they're not fit even to be governesses because they're so obviously poor. I think Barchester's a fairly nice place. I think that Puddingdale is probably a fairly nice place, I bet. Well, anyway, you get her point. I'm not going to argue with her, that's for sure. Not when she's in this kind of a mood. Mr. Quiverful proceeded to explain that he didn't think that Mrs. Proudie had anything to do with it. "Don't tell me," said Mrs. Quiverful. "I know more about it than that. Doesn't all the world know that Mrs. Proudie is the Bishop of Barchester, and that Mr. Slope is merely her creature? Wasn't it she made me the promise, just as though the thing were in her own particular gift? I tell you, it was that woman who sent him over here today, because, for some reason of her own, she wants to go back from her word." She didn't. She has no idea what Mr. Slope said. "My dear, you're wrong." "No, Q, don't be so soft. Take my word for it. The bishop knows no more about this than Jemima does." Jemima was the 2-year-old that they had. "And if you will take my advice, you will lose no time in going over and seeing him yourself." He calls her Letitia, but when she's angry at him, she calls him Mr. Quiverful, and when she's friendly with him, she calls him Q. It's kind of charming. Soft, however, as Mr. Quiverful might be, he would not allow himself to be talked out of his opinion on this occasion, and proceeded with much minuteness to explain to his wife the tone in which Mr. Slope had spoken of Mrs. Proudie's interference in diocesan matters. As he did so, a new idea gradually instilled itself into the matron's head, and a new course of conduct presented itself for her judgment. What if, after all, Mrs. Proudie knew nothing of this visit of Mr. Slope's? I rather like Letitia Quiverful. She can see through a brick wall if you give her enough time. In that case, might it not be possible that lady would still be staunch in her matter, still stand her friend, and perhaps possibly carry her through in opposition to Mr. Slope? Mrs. Quiverful said nothing as this vague hope occurred to her, but listened with more than ordinary patience to what her husband had to say. While he was still explaining that in all probability the world was wrong in its estimation of Mrs. Proudie's power and authority, she had fully made up her mind as to her own course of action. She did not, however, proclaim her intention. She shook her head ominously as he continued his narration, and when he had completed, she rose to go, merely observing that it was cruel treatment. She then asked him if he would mind waiting for a late dinner instead of dining at the usual hour of 3, and having received from him a concession on this point, she proceeded to carry her purpose into execution. She determined that she would at once go to the palace, that she would do so, if possible, before Mrs. Proudie could have had an interview with Mr. Slope, and that she should be either submissively piteous and pathetic, or else indignant, violent, and exacting, according to the manner in which she was received. She was quite confident in her own power. Strengthened as she was by the pressing want of 14 children, she felt she could make her way through legions of episcopal servants, and force herself, if need be, into the presence of the lady who had so wronged her. She had no shame about it, no dread of archdeacons. She would, as she declared to her husband, make her wail heard in the marketplace if she did not get redress and justice. It might be very well for an unmarried young curate to be shamefaced in such matters. It might be all right for a snug rector, really in want of nothing, but still looking for better preferment, should carry on his affairs decently under the rose, in other words, sub rosa. But Mrs. Quiverful, with 14 children, had given over being shamefaced, and in some things had given over being decent. If it were intended that she should be ill-used in the manner proposed by Mr. Slope, it would not be done under the rose. All the world should know of it. Uh-oh. Oh, goodness. Oh, what's that on you, baby? If you've got some sort of schmutz on you. Oh, ooh. Please get that off. There we go. Her tight little wiry hair, it picks up everything. You should see when we're on our walks, her whiskers, it ends up looking like an ant. She's got twigs and leaves everywhere. So anyway, where were we? Okay, here we go. In her present mood, Mrs. Quiverful was not over careful about her attire. She tied her bonnet under her chin, threw her shawl over her shoulders, armed herself with an old family cotton umbrella, and started for Barchester. A journey to the palace was not quite so easy a thing for Mrs. Quiverful as for our friend at Plumstead. Plumstead is 9 miles from Barchester, and Puddingdale is but 4. But the Archdeacon could order round his brougham, and his high-trotting, fast bay gelding would take him into the city within an hour. There was no brougham in coach-house at Puddingdale Vicarage, no bay-horse in the stables. There was no method of locomotion for its inhabitants but that which nature had assigned to man. Mrs. Quiverful was a broad, heavy woman, not young, nor given to walking. In her kitchen and in the family dormitories she was active enough, but her pace and gait were not adapted for the road. A walk into Barchester and back in the middle of an August day would be to her a terrible task, if not altogether impracticable. There was living in the parish, about half a mile from the vicarage on the road to the city, a decent, kindly farmer, well-to-do as regards this world, and so far mindful of the next world that he attended to his parish church with decent regularity. To him, Mrs. Quiverful had before now appealed in some of her more pressing family troubles, and had not appealed in vain. At his door she now presented herself, and having explained to his wife that the most urgent business required her to go at once into Barchester, begged that Farmer Subsoil would take her thither in his tax cart. The farmer did not reject her plan, and soon as Prince could be got into his collar, they started on their journey. Mrs. Quiverful did not mention the purpose of her business, nor did the farmer alloy his kindness by any unseemly questions. She merely begged to be put down at the bridge going into the city, and to be taken up again at the same place in the course of 2 hours. The farmer promised to be punctual in his appointment, and the lady, supported by her umbrella, took the short cut to the close, and in a few minutes was before the bishop's door. Hitherto she had felt no dread with regard to coming interview. She had felt nothing but an indignant longing to pour forth her claims and declare her wrongs if those claims were not fully admitted. But now the difficulty of her situation touched her a little. She had been at the palace once before, but then she went to give grateful thanks. Those who have thanks to return for favors received find easy admittance within the halls of the great. Such is not always the case with men or even women who have favors to beg. Still less easy for access to those who demand the fulfillment of promises already made. Mrs. Quiverful had not been slow to learn the ways of the world. She knew all this, and she knew also that her cotton umbrella and all but ragged shawl would not command respect in the eyes of the palatial servants. Can she get to Mrs. Proudie, is her question. If she were too humble, she knew well she would never succeed. To overcome by imperious overbearing with such a shawl as hers upon her shoulder and such a bonnet on her head would have required a personal bearing very superior to that which nature had endowed her. Of this also Mrs. Quiverful was aware. She must make it known that she was the wife of a gentleman and a clergyman, and must yet condescend to conciliate. The poor lady knew but one way to overcome these difficulties at the threshold of her enterprise, and to this she resorted. The surest way to get past a surly footman. Low as were the domestic funds at Puddingdale, she still retained possession of £half-a-crown, and this she sacrificed to the avarice of Mrs. Proudie's metropolitan sesquipedalian serving-man. She was, she said, Mrs. Quiverful of Puddingdale, the wife of Reverend Mr. Quiverful. She wished to see Mrs. Proudie. It was indeed quite indispensable that she should see Mrs. Proudie. James Fitchplus, looked worse than dubious, did not know whether his lady were in or out, engaged or in her bedroom, thought it most probable that she was subject to one of those or some other cause that would make her invisible. But Mrs. Quiverful could sit down in the waiting room while the inquiry was being made of Mrs. Proudie's maid. "Look here, my man," said Mrs. Quiverful, "I must see her." And she put her card and half a crown, think of it, my dear reader, think of it, her last half crown, into the man's hand, and sat herself down on the chair in the waiting room. Whether the bride carried the day, or whether the bishop's wife really chose to see the vicar's wife, it boots not now to inquire. The man returned, and begging Mrs. Quiverful to follow him, ushered her into the presence of the mistress of the diocese. So it worked. The bride is probably what worked. Mrs. Quiverful at once saw that her patroness was in a smiling humor. My patroness is bouncing all over the place here. Triumph sat throned upon her brow, and all the joys of dominion hovered about her curls. Her lord had that morning contested her with a great point. He had received an invitation to spend a couple of days with the archbishop. His soul longed for the gratification. Not a word, however, in his grace's note alluded to the fact of his being a married man. And in his grace's note alluded to the fact of his being a married man, and if he went at all, he must go alone. This necessity would have prevented an insurmountable bar to the visit, or have militated against such the pleasure, had he been able to go without any reference to Mrs. Proudie, but this he could not do. So the invitation from the archbishop came, but it did not mention bringing his wife. And the point being made here is that if Mr. Proudie were a different kind of man and Mrs. Proudie a different kind of woman, it wouldn't matter. He'd just pack up his portmanteau and hit the road. He'd say, "I'll be back in a few days. Never mind where I'm going." But that's not the way things are. But this he could not do. He could not order his portmanteau to be packed and started with his own man, merely telling the lady of his heart that he would probably be back on Saturday. There are men, may we not say rather monsters, who do such things, and there are wives, may we not say rather slaves, who put up with such usage. But Dr. and Mrs. Proudie were not among the number. The bishop, with some beating about the bush, made the lady understand that he very much wished to go, and the lady, without any beating around the bush, made the bishop understand that she wouldn't hear of it. It would be useless here to repeat the arguments that were used on each side, and needless to record the result. Those who are married will understand very well how the battle was lost and won, and those who are single will never understand it till they have learned the lesson which experience alone can give. When Mrs. Quiverful was shown into Mrs. Proudie's room, that lady had only returned a few minutes from her lord. But before she left him, she had seen the answer to the archbishop's note written and sealed. No wonder her face was wreathed in smiles as she received Mrs. Quiverful. She stood there while her husband declined the invitation. She stood there while he wrote it out. She instantly spoke of the subject which was so near and dear to her visitor. "Well, Mrs. Quiverful," she said, "is it decided when you are to move to Barchester?" That woman, as she had an hour or two since been called, became instantly re-endowed with all the graces that can adorn a bishop's wife. Mrs. Quiverful immediately saw that her business was to be piteous, and that nothing was to be gained by indignation. Nothing, indeed, unless she could be indignant in company with her patroness. "Oh, Mrs. Proudie," she began, "I fear we are not to move to Barchester at all." "Why not?" said the lady sharply, dropping at a moment's notice her smiles and condescension, and turning with her sharp, quick way to the business which she saw at a glance was important. For just a fraction of a second, she's thinking maybe Quiverful is going to refuse, which will not happen. No one brooks her will. And then Mrs. Quiverful told her tale. As she progressed in the history of her wrongs, she perceived that the heavier she leant upon Mr. Slope, the blacker became Mrs. Proudie's brow, but that such blackness was not injurious to her own cause. When Mr. Slope was at Puddingdale Vicarage that morning, she had regarded him as the creature of the Lady Bishop. Now she perceived that they were enemies. She admitted her mistake to herself without any pain or humiliation. She had but one feeling, and that was confined to her family. She cared little how she twisted or turned among those newcomers at Bishop's Palace, so long as she could twist with her husband into the warden's house. She cared not which was her friend and which was her enemy, if only she could get this preferment which she so sorely wanted. She told her tale, and Mrs. Proudie listened to it almost in silence. She told how Mr. Slope had cozened her husband into resigning his claim and had declared that it was the bishop's will that none but Mr. Harding should be warden. Mrs. Proudie's brow became blacker and blacker. At last she started from her chair and, begging Mrs. Quiverful to sit and wait for her return, marched out of the room. "Oh, Mrs. Proudie, it's for the 14 children, for 14 children." Such was the burden that fell on her ears as she closed the door behind her. Dun, dun, dun. So we get rather a lot of scene setting here of what, all the falderall that Mrs. Quiverful has to go to in order to get to Barchester. It's only a few miles, but she's an old housewife. She's not able to walk that distance in the blowing August heat. So we get a lot about that. But the main point of the scene is both to bring matters to a head and leave us on a cliffhanger. Matters are brought to a head because the last thing Mr. Slope expected is that Mrs. Quiverful would hear the news that Mr. Quiverful is not getting the wardenship and immediately beat a path to the bishop's door, and much less be admitted. The last thing he thought is that this would happen. He was counting on the fact, riding back to Barchester, he was counting on the fact that he would have time to work on the bishop, to bring him around, so that they present a unified front against Mrs. Proudie. That has not happened. Mrs. Quiverful has stolen a march on the chaplain and has let Mrs. Proudie know that her chaplain has directly contravened her will and lied about it. So we'll move on to the next chapter next time. Things are about to come to a head. And keep in mind, we got a little teaser that we have not yet been made clear. We were at Plumstead Episcopi, right, with our group of familiar characters, Dr. and Mrs. Grantley, Eleanor Bold, Mr. Arabin. We were there, and we were told 2 chapters ago that one day a storm broke in the confines of that house, and that the very morning that they were all happy and cheerful together at breakfast, the evening of that day, they were at daggers drawn. So we've got a little bit of narrative tension here, but the main thing we're doing here is a classic cliffhanger, which is what is going to happen. What is Mrs. Proudie can't even control herself enough to bid Mrs. Quiverful good day and tell her, "I will look into this." She has to leave the room and act right away. So we'll move on to the next chapter next time. Sorry, I love this stuff, so I'm hoping that you're all enjoying it. But I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.